Every single one of us here on site and online, we have doubt. We have unbelief in our lives. Every single one of us. If you are a follower of Jesus, you do have some. If you're not a follower of Jesus, you have some. If you're younger, if you're older, you have doubt and unbelief in your life. Now, that doesn't have to be bad news. Now, if that doubt and unbelief is like your goal is the ultimate thing, then yes, it's bad news. But it doesn't have to be bad news if it's not that ultimate thing. Listen to a psychologist, Rollo May, from the 20th century. Listen to what he said about this idea of commitment and doubt. I'll read it a couple times. It's a short quote, but it's very, very important. Listen to what he says about this idea of doubt. The relationship between commitment and doubt is by no means an antagonistic one. Commitment is healthiest when it is not without doubt, but in spite of doubt. So commitment and doubt are not like antagonistic. They're not enemies of each other. That commitment is strongest or healthiest when there is doubt, but we commit anyway. Everybody get that? So commitment, if you have no doubts, there's nothing you have to commit to. There's no commitment needed. It's in the midst of our doubts and questions and even unbelief where we make a commitment to God and say, God, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to believe even though I have doubts. So can we all agree this morning, those of you online as well, let's agree that we come into today, this little space for an hour that we call a worship service, and we have our doubts. We have unbelief in our lives. It's not an ultimate thing, but we all have that. And if you are somebody like we saw last week in Nicodemus, who is a religious person who previously had no doubts, had all his beliefs figured out, and then he had to realize that he had unbelief, that he had doubt, that he had questions, and that he needed to come to Jesus with those. So that's what this little space is to be about today. And it's going to feel a little bit different. First of all, I'm going to speak a little bit shorter. You can cheer now if you'd like. That's okay. And then we're going to have a time, as we do once in a while. Those of you who are regulars know, we call it a time of healing. It's going to be a time of prayer and healing. It'll be a little bit longer today. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Aaron and Kendall are going to lead that time. So we want to start off, though, and look at one final story, and we'll dive into it and then go from there. So it's found in Mark chapter 9, and it starts like this. There's a father who comes to Jesus with his son, and the father is absolutely desperate. He is at the end of hope. He's at the end of faith. He doesn't know what to do. He's brought this child to the disciples to have them pray for healing. They have not been able to heal him. And so he comes to Jesus. And this child is what we would call today having something like severe epilepsy that has no medication to it. So in spiritual terms, it said that he was possessed by a demon. And it threw him into fits. It tried to kill him. And the father is just beyond himself. He's beside himself. Some of us can relate to this, not just about our kids, but about spouse or sibling or friends. Think about somebody who is addicted to something, like an opioid, which there's an epidemic of that. Or maybe a kid who is just wayward, who won't talk to a parent. Or maybe that's the case with a sibling. Or maybe it's that if you're married, your marriage might be like this. So we have these kinds of situations in our lives where, like this man, we're desperate. So listen to Jesus' interaction with him. This is Mark 9, verse 21 to 25. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this with this demon?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." If you can, Jesus says, everything is possible for one who believes. Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe, and help me in my unbelief." I do believe, and help me overcome my unbelief. When Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." And the spirit, and that evil spirit left him, and Jesus helped the boy up, and he was in his right mind. All right, we want to talk about just two things, and then we're going to go into this time of prayer and healing. Number one is our real desperation and need for humility. Number one. Number two is our unbelief is not an end, but a beginning. Our unbelief is not an end, it's a beginning, if we allow it to be. So first, our real desperation and need. You remember last week, Pastor Brian talked about Nicodemus. It was John chapter 3. And he made a point, it was very, very important. He said that Nicodemus was objectively lost, like there was facts that he was lost. And that story was about him experiencing subjectively that lostness. In other words, religious people, the Pharisees of the time, they were objectively lost, but they didn't know it. So they were objectively lost, but subjectively, they didn't think they were lost. Well, Nicodemus is this guy who goes from being objectively lost to subjectively experiencing that lostness. This week, we encounter a guy and his boy who are objectively lost as well. And they have their entire lives subjectively experienced that lostness because of this physical ailment. So two different scenarios, but the same thing that's going on in them. So just keep that in mind, this sense of being objectively lost and subjectively experiencing it. And I would dare say, in this room and online, there are people in both of these categories. There are some of you who, for a variety of reasons, you have been a churchgoer, you've been a religious person, you've been self-sufficient, you've done yoga, you've done whatever you've done, that you have thought that you're okay. But you are objectively lost, kind of like that guy Nicodemus. And something is stirring in you, it has maybe been for the last several weeks, that you go, wait a minute, I'm not so found. I'm actually maybe lost. I'm in the wrong place. And then there's others of you who relate to this story today that you also are lost, but you have experienced it, you know it. And you're kind of desperate. Now, I would argue that all of us should have that sense of desperation, although many of us who have hung around with church people a lot, we kind of remove ourselves from that desperation and that hurt and that pain and that wounding because we replace it with things like Netflix and Hulu and everything else you can list that is about entertaining ourselves or distracting ourselves from that. So Jesus says to him, the guy says to him, if you can do anything, and Jesus responds, everything is possible for one who believes. And the guy's response is, I do believe, help me in my unbelief. Help me overcome my unbelief. See, Jesus is not saying, oh, if you believe, everything's gonna be fine. If you believe, I'm gonna heal everything. What Jesus is saying is that you, as a follower of Jesus, set no limits on what God can do. Now, that does not mean that God will do whatever we want, but we set no limits on God's power to change and transform. And so that's what this guy is asking in Help Me in My Unbelief. This desperate call and cry. And you know what it translates into? It translates into great humility on his part. This great sense of God is able to do everything. I don't know if he'll answer my prayer, but I know that he can heal my son, whether he will or not. I've mentioned this story before from my past that it's just very poignant for me. It's really important for me. And so if you've heard it before, you'll hear it again. And you can laugh at me again. So about 15 years ago, I went to my 25-year college reunion. And you know, college reunions, like after 25 years, you haven't seen these people. And so everybody's checking out each other's name tags because you don't exactly look the same as you did 25 years ago for a variety of reasons. And so I was at this, this was up in upstate New York where I went to school. I was at this beginning of the reunion cocktail party kind of thing. It was like 100, 150 people in a pretty crowded room. And I'm just hanging out and talking with a couple people I know. The vast majority of people in this room I have not seen for 25 years, right? That's kind of the nature of reunions. And so from as far across the room as possible, I see this gal who I recognize right away. Her name is Amy. And we just kind of catch a glimpse of each other because there's people's heads in the way and stuff. But as I keep looking over there and I keep looking, and she looks stunned to see me. I mean, she is like this. She's like, she is just shocked at seeing me, just shocked. And I'm thinking, I don't think she thinks I'm more handsome now. Like, I don't think that's what's going on inside her. And so I was a little just surprised by this. And at that moment, I realized, we were walking toward each other, and as I was thinking, as I was getting close to her and as I was interacting with people, it kind of brought me back to when I was 18, 19, 20 years old. And I was a mess. I was massively, massively broken. I drank too much. I was drunk a whole bunch of the time. I was reckless. It was just, I was an absolute mess. Talk about desperation. My coming to faith in Jesus was just utter desperation that if I didn't, I would have killed myself. So as I'm walking closer and closer to Amy, she just looks like she's seen a ghost. And I get closer and she's like, and we stop and we're a couple feet away and she's like, Brian Newman? I was like, yeah. She's like, I thought you'd be dead by now. And she was serious. She was absolutely serious. And I kind of laughed for a moment, and then it just sort of dawned on me. God had saved me. I was a desperate mess, an absolute mess. And in her mind, she had worked out the logical consequences of how I had lived. And she thought, rightfully, that I should be dead. And I walked away from that encounter, and I was so humbled by that moment. And I remember just saying to God, I thank you doesn't cover it. Like it just doesn't cover it. But thank you. Thank you for your grace. Thank you for your mercy. Thank you that you didn't leave me in that place, that mess. And thank you for that kind of almost prophetic witness from Amy, who kind of you used to give me a glimpse of that desperation I felt and the humility that I needed. And this guy in Mark 9 is feeling like that as well. And by the way, going back those 25 years, I had lots of unbelief in my life. There were very few things that I believed correctly. The one thing I began to believe correctly is that Jesus could save me. Other than that, I was very much a mess. So that's number one, is that we need to have this sense of desperation in our lives, not just to come to Jesus for the first time, but over and over and over again. So here's my question for all of us today. How desperate do you need God? How desperate today are you and me for Jesus? And are our hearts humbled toward that question and toward that reality? And then number two, our unbelief is not an end, it's a beginning. I think many of us would agree, in today's world, unbelief and doubt is sort of glamorized. Like, oh, it's cool not to believe. Or you believe your own thing. Like, there's some kind of glamour to it all. I was reminded of a quote by Dallas Willard, who passed into eternity some years ago. He said this, I love this quote. He says, "We live in a culture that has cultivated the idea that the skeptical person is always smarter than the one who believes. You can almost be as stupid as a cabbage as long as you doubt." You can almost be as stupid as a cabbage as long as you doubt. Okay, let's dispel that. The goal is not for us to doubt and have unbelief. It is stated that this guy in this story has doubt and unbelief, and that Jesus is about dispelling it. Or think about this story. At the end of the Gospels, in John chapter 20, there's this guy by the name of Didymus, who is called Thomas. And Thomas, many of us know him as the doubting Thomas. And the reason is that a bunch of the disciples saw Jesus who had been raised from the dead, but Thomas wasn't there. And they met Thomas later on, and they said, "We saw Jesus, he was raised from the dead." And Thomas is like, "I'm not gonna believe it unless I see it. I'm not gonna believe it." And then Jesus shows up about a week later. And Thomas rightfully humbles himself out of his unbelief. And it is the beginning of his faith of saying, "My Lord and my God." He moves from this unbelief place to belief. And so that unbelief was the starting point, but not the ending point. It was what he needed to be, where he needed to be then, but then that needed to be disproved. That unbelief needed to be disproved. So here's the question that I have for us as we come toward this time of prayer and healing. What's the area in your life that you're asking God to dispel unbelief? What's the area or areas of your life where you're asking God to dispel unbelief or doubt? Whatever that might be. It might be about something personal to yourself. It might be someone in your family. It might be about some kind of healing, physical or emotional or spiritual. As we come to this time, and those of you who've been around for a while, you know you'll have an opportunity to come forward if you'd like. There'll be some people here to pray for you. So consider what that is and how God might be asking you here and now and online to respond to him. Before we go into the wider healing time, I want to just take a moment, as this is a series that we've called Lost and Found. There is always amongst us, some of us who do not yet believe. Online, there are, here as well. You might be a churchgoer for a number of years and not be a follower of Jesus. You might be brand new to church. You might have just tuned in online for the first time or the 10th time or whatever. You might have gone to church as a kid and have come back or whatever. There's all different situations that we're in. But I want to give us an opportunity to respond to Jesus. Somebody did that for me a whole bunch of years ago, and I think it's important that we do that somewhat regularly in our lives. So in a moment, I'm going to put a prayer up here that I'm going to read. And if you are in a place of committing for the first time, or you've been really far from God and you're committing again, you're coming back to God, you can just say this or something similar in your heart and just pray that along. If you do that, if you're on site here, here's what I'd like you to do. After I pray, and as we're having that time of healing and prayer that Aaron and Kendall will lead, I'd like you to, if you make that commitment, if you pray this prayer, I'd like you to come forward. Becky Rice is going to be over here. I'm going to be over here, and Brian Rice is going to be over here, and Aaron Anderson is going to be over here. Folks, if you could come up and stand there now, if you would. I don't know where Becky is at the moment, but so you can just see them. So I'd like us to pray that prayer, those of you who want to. For those of you online, Jay is also going to lead you in this time as well. And he'll be facilitating this as well. So let's take a moment and pray, and then Aaron and Kendall will come. So pray this. Jesus, I need you. I need you desperately. I cannot save myself. I cannot do life on my own, by my own power. I have sinned against you and against others. And now I receive your forgiveness. You died to forgive me. You pursued me to be in relationship with you, and I no longer want to hide. I don't want to hide from you. Here I am. And thank you for loving me and being gracious to me. Lord, as we come to this time of prayer and healing, move in our hearts, stir us. Lord, we give you this time. Lord, I just pray for those who may have just prayed that prayer, that you would help them know you are present with them, and we would just invite them to come up and speak with Brian or Aaron or Becky or myself, and that we would just acknowledge that with them and just pray a prayer of blessing on them. Lord, we give you this time. In Christ's name.
Hey there. Thanks for watching Living Word Community Church's YouTube channel. You can click to watch our most recent message and hit the subscribe button so you never miss a video or a live stream. We look forward to seeing you soon.